On the morning of May 5, 2009, Chris Coleman, a husband and father, left his home to go to the gym. When he returned, his entire family was dead. Chris, a former Marine and a devoted Christian, lived what seemed like an ideal life with his wife, Sheri, and their 2 young sons in Columbia, Illinois. He worked as a security officer for renowned televangelist Joyce Meyer, a job that had him frequently traveling for work. But beneath this picture-perfect existence, an undercurrent of fear had begun to take hold. The Coleman family had been receiving terrifying anonymous threats. Chris claimed he had kissed his wife goodbye that morning before heading to his workout. But when he tried to contact her during his gym session and received no response, he grew anxious. Given the threats they'd been receiving, he feared the worst and called a neighbor, who also happened to be a police officer, to check on his family. When the police arrived, they found an open window at the back of the house. Inside, they were hit with the strong, acrid scent of spray paint. Disturbing messages were scrawled in red paint on the walls, phrases like "punished" and "I am always watching." And then came the gruesome discovery. Sheri and her 2 sons, 11-year-old Garrett and 9-year-old Gavin, were found strangled in their beds. Sheri's body was face down and completely nude, showing clear signs of rigor mortis. Her hair was found on Gavin's body, suggesting she had been killed first. The boys had been strangled with a ligature, and their lifeless bodies were defiled with spray paint. When Chris arrived back at the house, the police stopped him outside. Upon hearing that his family was dead, he cried, but made no attempt to rush inside. The crime scene, the method of murder, and the graffiti pointed to something far more sinister than a random attack. To understand this horrific crime, we must go back to how it all started. Columbia, Illinois, where the Colemans lived, was a peaceful suburb just south of St. Louis, Missouri. Rated safer than 69% of American cities, violent crime was rare. But safety statistics mean nothing when the real danger is inside your own home. Sheri Coleman, a 31-year-old homemaker, had never imagined that the greatest threat to her family would come from within. She and Chris had built a comfortable life, despite his frequent travels with Joyce Meyer's ministry. They had met in the late 1990s while both were serving in the military, Chris in the Marine Corps, Sheri in the Air Force. Their relationship had moved quickly, leading to marriage and children in rapid succession. Chris's work for Joyce Meyer paid well, $100,000 a year, which allowed Sheri to stay home with their children. But the job also meant he was often away, leaving his family vulnerable. That vulnerability became terrifyingly clear in November 2008, when Chris received the first threatening email. The email, sent from an anonymous account called destroychris@gmail.com, was laced with threats and profanities. The subject line read, "Chris's family, they are dead." The sender warned that if Joyce Meyer didn't stop preaching, Chris's family would be murdered. The threats were specific and chilling, mentioning Meyer's upcoming conferences and book tours, proving the sender had inside knowledge of her schedule, and, by extension, Chris's schedule. A few months later, in January 2009, another threat arrived. This time, it was a handwritten letter placed in the Colemans' mailbox. It ordered them to publicly renounce their faith, warning, "Time is running out for you and your family." The letter contained misspellings, notably the word opportunities, which was spelled incorrectly. As the months passed, the threats intensified. In April, Chris received another letter, this time reading, "I am giving you the last warning." The writer accused him of living a fake religious life, protecting a fraud, and stealing money from people. "Your worst nightmare is about to happen," the letter warned. Alarmed, Chris contacted the police, but efforts to trace the messages led nowhere. His next-door neighbor, Detective Sergeant Justin Below, took a personal interest in the case and installed a security camera aimed at the Colemans' mailbox, hoping to catch the person responsible for leaving the letters. But then, on May 5, the threats turned into a horrifying reality. That morning, Chris left for the gym around 5:43 a.m. As he drove back home over the Mississippi River, he called Detective Barlow, asking him to check on Sheri. She wasn't answering her phone, which was unusual. Barlow, aware of the threats, immediately called his department for backup and met with another officer in front of the Coleman house. They rang the doorbell. No answer. Moving around to the back of the house, they found an open window, the screen propped up against a table. As they entered, they were overwhelmed by the chemical stench of spray paint. Disturbing messages covered the walls, written in blood-red paint: "You have paid. Punished. I am always watching." Then they made the horrifying discovery: Sheri and her sons, lifeless in their beds. At that moment, they heard a noise from the basement. Chris had arrived home. They quickly intercepted him and told him to wait outside. They continued their investigation, piecing together what had happened. The bodies showed signs of rigor mortis, indicating that they had been killed much earlier than when Chris had left for the gym. The medical examiner later determined their time of death to be between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., while Chris was still in the house. This changed everything. Chris claimed to have kissed his wife goodbye before leaving for the gym. But the timeline didn't add up. She had already been dead. Other evidence began to surface. Chris had fresh scratch marks on his arm, which he tried to cover with a blanket during questioning. The handwriting in the spray-painted messages matched Chris's own handwriting. The security camera outside never recorded anyone placing a letter in the mailbox. Most damning of all, the surveillance footage showed that no one entered the house after Chris left. If no intruder had come in, who else could have killed the Colemans? The truth was beginning to unfold, and it was darker than anyone had imagined. At 6:56 a.m., Chris Coleman's black SUV rolled into the driveway of his upscale home in Columbia, Illinois. The morning air was cool, but there was a palpable tension surrounding the quiet suburban street. The police had already arrived, having secured the scene, but it wasn't until Chris made his way into the driveway that things began to escalate. Just 13 minutes earlier, Chris had made a call to his co-worker and friend, Detective Justin Barlow, from the Jefferson Barracks Bridge. The phone call was calm. Chris sounded shaken but not entirely frantic, despite the horror awaiting him back at home. He had reported that something was wrong, that his wife and children were possibly victims of an intruder. The thing that stood out immediately, though, was the timeline. Typically, the drive from the bridge to the Coleman's house took around 7 minutes. That morning, however, it took Chris nearly double that time. In a situation where urgency was paramount, why was he delayed? Had he been nervous? Was he trying to fabricate an alibi, or worse, had he been disposing of evidence before the police arrived? The investigators would later ask themselves these questions. Was Chris ensuring that the scene looked untouched, waiting for the police to find the bodies before he did? His arrival at the scene seemed almost too calculated, as if he had deliberately slowed his pace, possibly to allow the police to establish the crime scene while he remained uninvolved. The timing was too strange to ignore. As the officers in the area processed the crime scene, their instincts began to flare. Something didn't add up about Chris's call to Barlow, the delay in his arrival, and his odd demeanor when he pulled into the driveway. The facts alone raised red flags, and though the police didn't yet have concrete evidence, they had enough reason to bring him in for questioning. Back at the station, Chris was subjected to nearly 6 hours of intensive questioning. The officers were methodical, using the information they had gathered about the deaths and the time of his arrival to challenge his version of events. At first, Chris seemed cooperative, his emotions fluctuating between confusion and anxiety, but as the interview continued, cracks began to show in his story. The detectives honed in on the most crucial element: the timing. The central issue was this: the time of death. Investigators had already determined that Sheri, Gavin, and Garrett had been dead for several hours before Chris called 911. How did he not know that? His behavior struck them as somewhat detached, especially in such an emotional and chaotic situation. They had just witnessed the grisly aftermath of what appeared to be a brutal family murder, yet here was Chris, arriving a little too composed, almost as if he were trying to control the narrative of the scene. The police had already begun to piece together a disturbing picture, but there were many holes left to fill. They weren't sure whether Chris was guilty or just a grieving husband trying to process the unimaginable. But something about the situation raised too many red flags to simply dismiss. By the time Chris stepped out of his SUV, the officers had already secured the crime scene. Crime scene investigators were photographing the house, and paramedics had already confirmed the deaths of his wife, Sheri, and their 2 young sons, Garrett and Gavin. The grotesque violence that had been inflicted on the family made it clear that this wasn't a simple home invasion gone wrong. It was something much darker, and Chris was at the center of it all. The police were quick to bring Chris in for questioning. Though there was no conclusive evidence against him yet, his strange behavior and delayed arrival at the scene were enough to warrant further scrutiny. They wasted no time. For the next 6 hours, Chris sat in an interrogation room, his mind racing as they slowly dissected his every move. Initially, he claimed that he had no idea what had happened, that he'd been out of the house at the time of the murders. He even insisted that he had tried to reach his wife multiple times before calling Barlow. Yet, as the interview dragged on, the inconsistencies in his story began to show. "Did you leave the house this morning before calling us?" one of the investigators asked. "Yeah," Chris answered quickly. I left the house early. I was just heading out, for work or whatever." His words didn't match the timeline, though. The investigators had already pieced together that the family's deaths had occurred sometime during the early morning hours, while Chris was supposed to have been at home. "Chris, are you sure you're telling me everything?" the investigator pressed, his voice calm but firm. "What would you say if I told you that your wife and kids were likely already dead when you left this morning?" Chris hesitated. His eyes darted around the room, and he shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I don't know," he stammered. I don't know what to say." The investigators weren't buying it. They calmly laid out the evidence to him, the time of death of his wife and kids, how the medical examiner could pinpoint the exact moments when they were killed. They also explained how they could tell from the state of the bodies and the scene that it wasn't some random act of violence. They were trying to get him to crack, to admit that he had been part of the murders, even if only in a moment of rage. "You have to understand, Chris," one investigator said, his voice lowering, "we're not here to judge you. We just want the truth. Maybe something happened, maybe you acted out of anger, or fear, or desperation. It's understandable, but you have to be honest with us. It's the only way out of this." The detectives were trying a tactic of empathy, trying to put him at ease. They wanted him to confess, to give them something, anything, that could help them understand why this happened. But as they continued to press him, the small inconsistencies in his statements became harder to ignore. He claimed that he hadn't noticed anything unusual when he left the house, that everything seemed normal. Yet, when asked about the threatening emails his family had been receiving, emails that he had been pretending were from an unknown stalker, he seemed to flinch. They dug deeper into the threats, and Chris was forced to acknowledge that there were emails, but he kept insisting that he had nothing to do with them. But the evidence was mounting, and as they continued their questioning, they brought up one crucial detail that would shake Chris's story even further. "We found paint at your house, Chris," an investigator said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Bright red spray paint, just like the one used in the graffiti on your wife's car. You don't have any paint at your house, do you?" Chris's eyes widened slightly. No. I don't think so," he stammered, clearly flustered. But a quick search of his recent purchases revealed a receipt for a can of the very same bright red spray paint he had just denied owning. The lies were stacking up, and the investigators could feel the pressure mounting on Chris. He wasn't confessing, but the more they probed, the more he seemed to slip up. They then confronted him with a detail that would change everything, an email account they had traced back to him. The emails had contained threatening messages that led the investigators to believe that the person behind them had a personal connection to the family. After a thorough search of his computer, the investigators found something chilling: several emails sent from Chris's account. Not only had he been sending the threats, but the spelling of the word opportunities, spelled with an extra, was a signature mistake that had been found in multiple emails and messages sent by Chris himself. It was the final piece of the puzzle. Chris Coleman was no longer a confused husband who had stumbled upon a crime scene. He was a suspect, a man who had been planning his family's demise, driven by a twisted motive. The investigators were now certain that Chris had killed his wife and children, though the exact reasons behind his actions remained unclear. As the interrogation continued, the evidence against him only grew more compelling. The investigators had enough now to charge him with the brutal murders of Sheri, Garrett, and Gavin Coleman. It was just a matter of time before the truth came to light, and Chris's carefully constructed lies began to crumble under the weight of the evidence. The biggest question remained: why? Sheri and Chris had been struggling in their marriage for quite some time. At one point, They even discussed the possibility of divorce. The tension between them was palpable, unspoken resentments simmered beneath the surface. But despite their disagreements, Sheri wasn't entirely willing to go through with it. According to some reports, Joyce Meyer, the influential figure behind the ministry where Chris worked, also didn't want the divorce to happen. Joyce Meyer's ministry wasn't just a place of work, it was a way of life. Its moral expectations were strict, and divorce wasn't simply frowned upon. It could cost Chris his job, his livelihood, and his place within the ministry. The idea of a divorce would be scandalous, potentially destroying his standing in the community. But there was something else in the picture, something that seemed to cloud everything: Tara Lince. Tara Lince wasn't just a friend. She was Chris's mistress. Tara, a 31-year-old cocktail waitress from Florida, had known Sheri since high school. She and Chris had started an affair months earlier, a relationship that quickly escalated from mere flirtation to something far more serious. According to Tara, it wasn't just a fling, they were planning a future together. They shared intimate conversations about life and love, all while Chris maintained the illusion of a happy marriage. But the relationship was far from simple. Investigators later combed through Chris's phone, and what they found was damning. Hundreds of explicit photos and videos of Chris and Tara together, captured in intimate moments. There was even a sex tape from their trip to Hawaii, a piece of evidence that painted a clear picture of the affair's seriousness. But perhaps the most incriminating discovery was something even more personal. On Tara's calendar, an event titled "Wedding to Chris Coleman." It wasn't just a casual relationship. In Tara's mind, their connection was far more permanent. Chris had promised Tara that he was going to leave Sheri. He told her that he had spoken to a divorce attorney, and that the papers were being drawn up. But as the days passed, there were signs of hesitation. Then, on May 4, 2009, just one day before the murders, Chris called in sick to work. He told Tara that the divorce papers had been delayed due to a misspelling. Tara was disappointed, but she had grown used to these setbacks. The next morning, however, everything changed. Sheri and the boys were dead. Did Chris decide he couldn't wait any longer to be with Tara? Or had he never truly intended to get a divorce in the first place? The timing was great. Chris wasn't the only Coleman man interested in Tara. Chris's brother Keith had sent her explicit photos. Sheri's own brother had even asked her to marry him over social media. But Tara had eyes only for Chris. Even at his trial, she wore the matching promise ring they had gotten together. She had been his ultimate escape plan. The problem? He needed Sheri and the boys gone first. Chris Coleman was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. His defense team argued there was no solid DNA evidence and no confession. And for a moment, it seemed to work. During deliberations, the jury was divided. 7 voted not guilty, while 5 believed he was guilty. At one point, they even sent a note to the judge. "We are a hung jury." But then, something changed. Jurors re-examined the evidence, including photos from Tara's BlackBerry. One photo caught their attention: Chris and Tara kissing. The date? October 21, 2008. Weeks before either of them had admitted to starting their affair. If he was lying about this, what else was he lying about? After 15 grueling hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. Guilty on all 3 counts. Chris Coleman was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He narrowly avoided the death penalty. Illinois had abolished it just months earlier. To this day, he maintains his innocence. His father, Pastor Ron Coleman, insists Chris couldn't have done it. He even defended his son's affair, saying, "Every man has his desires. If your wife doesn't respect you, you'll find respect somewhere else." Sheri's family sued Joyce Meyer Ministries, claiming they ignored the warning signs. But in 2013, the case was dismissed. Chris Coleman remains behind bars at Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. And in a chilling twist, he now shares a prison with another infamous family annihilator, Chris Watts, the man who murdered his wife and daughters in 2018. Was Chris Coleman's crime a blueprint for Watts' later murder? Or was he just another selfish man who saw his family as an obstacle? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. And remember, stay safe, stay aware, and we'll see you in the next one.